There is a moment in every empath's life that feels like a spiritual earthquake, a shift so internal yet so profound that it redefines their entire reality. It doesn't happen in a dramatic outburst or a cinematic confrontation. It begins quietly. It begins in the middle of confusion, exhaustion, and emotional depletion. The empath starts to question not the narcissist, but themselves. For so long, they've been wrapped in a cycle of giving and forgiving, of shrinking and sacrificing, all in the hope that love would be enough to soften someone who seemed incapable of truly seeing them. They've given patience when they received indifference, love when they were met with cruelty, and second chances when there was no remorse. But slowly, something begins to stir. At first, it feels like guilt. The idea of pulling away from someone who clearly depends on their compassion feels wrong. Empaths are wired to understand, to hold space, to fix, and to heal. But then comes the weariness, the bone-deep fatigue of constantly bending over backward for someone who offers only conditional approval, momentary affection, or worse, deliberate cruelty cloaked in charm. The empath starts to realize that their kindness is being weaponized, that their love has become currency in a manipulative economy, that the more they give, the less they're valued. And then the questions get louder. Why do I feel invisible? Why am I walking on eggshells? Why do I feel more alone with them than I do when I'm actually alone? These aren't just passing thoughts, they're a call to consciousness. The empath starts to connect the dots, not just between the narcissist patterns, but their own. The over-explaining, the need to be chosen, the way they've tolerated disrespect in the name of love. These realizations don't bring immediate peace. They bring pain, a deep grief, not just for the relationship, but for every time they betrayed themselves to preserve it. But within that, grief is power. It's the moment the empath starts to realize that love should not cost them their voice, their sanity, or their dignity. That love is not sacrifice without reciprocity, that healing someone else should never mean harming yourself. They begin to separate guilt from responsibility. They begin to see that empathy must have boundaries to be healthy. And in doing so, they begin to reclaim their sense of self. This awakening is not loud, but it is unshakable. It doesn't always come with tears. It often comes with stillness, a long pause, a look in the mirror, a quiet nod that says, I see now. And from that moment on, the empath begins to detach, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. They begin to walk away not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring for themselves. The awakening doesn't erase the love they once felt. It just removes the illusion that they ever had to abandon themselves to keep it. There is a particular kind of power that doesn't scream, it doesn't argue, it doesn't try to win the last word or twist itself into explanations that will never be understood. This power lives in silence, in a decision made deep within the soul, to no longer participate in a cycle that is both exhausting and dehumanizing. For the empath who has spent months or years entangled with a narcissist, this kind of strength is not about becoming louder. It's about becoming still. It's about no longer justifying your worth to someone who is never truly listening. It's about understanding that peace is not found in the approval of the person who caused the harm, but in the quiet decision to walk away without the need for closure or permission. My sisters thrive in chaos. It is their playground, their battleground, and their shield. In the chaos, they feel in control. When you are explaining, defending, crying, pleading, they feel important. They interpret your emotional reactions as evidence of their power. So when you stop reacting, when you stop dancing in their emotional whirlwind, when you withdraw the supply of energy that fuels their manipulation, they are left with a void they don't know how to handle. That void is silence. And silence, when chosen from a place of strength, is the loudest truth there is. This is not a silence born of fear or helplessness. It is a silence born of wisdom. The empath learns that engaging with someone who refuses to reflect, to take accountability, or to meet them in vulnerability is not strength. It's survival on borrowed time. Eventually, the constant justifying of your needs, the explaining of your feelings, and the hoping that one day they'll change all become too heavy to carry. So instead of yelling, the empath exhales. Instead of arguing, they step back. Instead of proving, they simply choose themselves. That choice does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it's simply not answering the phone, not replying to the message, not showing up to the emotional games that used to trap them. And in that absence, the narcissist begins to panic. They may lash out, they may hoover, they may beg or guilt or accuse, but none of that matters when the empath has truly decided to be free. Because strength, true strength, is knowing you could say something, but you don't have to. It's knowing that your dignity is not up for debate, that your value doesn't need validation, that your peace is too sacred to be tossed into someone else's storm. It takes immense inner fortitude to walk away from the chaos, especially when that chaos was once mistaken for love. But in doing so, the empath reclaims something precious. They stop trying to fix someone who benefits from staying broken. They stop trying to be heard by someone who only listens when they can twist the words. And they begin to live, not in reaction to pain, but in alignment with peace. When an empath walks away, something profound happens beneath the surface, something the narcissist is rarely prepared for. It's not just the loss of a partner or a companion. It's the abrupt end of their most essential psychological fuel, narcissistic supply. This supply isn't made up of love, care, or connection in the genuine sense. It's made of attention, admiration, emotional reactions, control, and validation. And when the empath leaves, often after months or years of emotional sacrifice, the narcissist finds themselves standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a void they cannot tolerate. Because the one person who gave them their sense of identity has finally stopped feeding the illusion. For a narcissist, supply isn't optional. It is their emotional oxygen. Every compliment, every tear, every argument, every attempt the empath made to understand them, every apology, given in moments the narcissist should have been the one to say sorry, all of it fed their ego and propped up a false sense of superiority and power. It created the illusion that they were worthy, dominant, and central to someone's world. Narcissistic supply isn't always positive attention either. It can be negative. A screaming match, a desperate plea, even anger from the empath. It all reinforces the narcissist's belief that they matter, that they still have emotional control. So when the empath disengages, when they go silent, when they stop reacting, the narcissist is forced to face the unbearable truth that they no longer have an audience. No one is left to mirror back the inflated self-image they constructed so carefully. This moment is not just difficult for the narcissist, it is devastating. Because underneath their mask of confidence lies a fragile, undeveloped sense of self. They rely on others to regulate their emotions, to validate their worth, and to distract them from the shame they've buried for years. The empath unknowingly became their emotional caretaker. Not just someone to love, but someone to manage their self-esteem, absorb their projections, and validate their grandiosity. When that system collapses, the narcissist is left with a mirror they cannot face. one that reflects insecurity, emotional immaturity, and deep loneliness. What follows is often a frantic attempt to restore the supply. This is where hoovering begins. Text messages filled with false apologies, sudden declarations of love, promises to change, or even rage and blame designed to provoke a reaction. The narcissist doesn't do this out of love. They do it out of need. Because without the empath's energy, attention, and emotional labor, they start to unravel. Their carefully constructed persona begins to crack. They may move on quickly to a new source of supply, but it rarely carries the same depth or devotion the empath gave. And eventually, even that new supply sees through the mask. In the end, the empath's exit is not just a personal decision. It is a disruption to the narcissist's entire ecosystem. The power dynamic shatters. The control dissipates. And the narcissist is left with the one thing they've spent their life trying to escape: themselves. When the empath walks away, the narcissist is suddenly left with a mirror they cannot control. And that mirror, now devoid of reflection from the empath, begins to expose the cracks they've worked so hard to hide. What emerges in this quiet, empty aftermath is not just a sense of loss, but a deep and unraveling identity crisis. The narcissist has spent years crafting a false self, one built on external validation, performance, charm, and manipulation. This identity was never formed through introspection or emotional growth. It was pieced together like armor, a carefully curated mask meant to conceal the vulnerability they refused to acknowledge. The empath played a vital role in keeping that mask in place. Every emotional reaction, every attempt to please or fix, every plea for understanding acted as a stabilizing force for the narcissist's fragile self. Emotion. But once the empath removes themselves from the equation, the narcissist loses their anchor and the illusion starts to slip. The narcissist's sense of self has always been conditional, shaped by how others perceive them and how much power they feel they hold in any relationship. Their identity is not rooted in who they truly are, but in how effectively they can control the narrative around them. Without the empath to reflect back admiration, fear, or frustration, they're left with silence, and silence is terrifying to someone who depends on being seen, envied, or desired to feel like they exist. In that silence, the narcissist begins to feel invisible, unimportant, exposed. The very feelings they've spent a lifetime suppressing start to rise: shame, insecurity, emptiness. And because they've never developed the tools to process or integrate those emotions, they panic. They may scramble to find a new source of validation, another relationship, an audience, even enemies, someone, anyone to respond to them. But nothing quite compares to the empath's depth. Nothing replaces the emotional availability, the forgiveness, the willingness to understand that the empath offered. And so even in the arms of a new supply, the narcissist feels hollow. It's not just about missing a person, it's about losing the version of themselves they could only maintain in the empath's presence. Without that dynamic, they're forced to face the truth that their power was borrowed, not built. That their confidence was constructed, not cultivated, that their charm was a performance, not a reflection of their character. And for someone whose identity depends entirely on external reinforcement, that realization is devastating. The collapse begins internally, often hidden from the outside world. Outwardly, they may appear the same, confident, composed, unaffected, but internally, they're unraveling. The more they try to deny the loss, the more unstable their sense of self becomes. They begin to question their worth, though they'd never admit it. They begin to feel anxious, empty, even desperate, though they disguise it with distraction or anger. And because their ego cannot allow vulnerability, they often lash out, spiral into manipulation, or retreat into isolation, trying to preserve whatever fragments of their false identity remain. But nothing fits quite right anymore. Without the empath, the mask starts to slip. And what lies beneath is someone who doesn't know who they are without someone else to define them. The collapse behind the mask doesn't happen all at once. It begins in silence, often after the empath has finally chosen to walk away, not in anger, but in a quiet decision to preserve their soul. To outsiders, the narcissist may still seem composed, maybe even thriving, because the mask they wear is polished, charming, confident, in control. But that exterior was never built on a solid foundation. It was shaped by performance, fueled by validation, and protected by manipulation. When the person who once reflected admiration, care, and emotional energy walks away, the narcissist is left with a gaping void. And in that emptiness, the carefully crafted facade begins to crack. For so long, they've used others, especially the empath, to maintain their sense of importance. They fed off of every reaction, every attempt to please, every emotional response. The chaos they created wasn't just dysfunction, it was structure. It gave them purpose. It allowed them to play both victim and hero, to control the rhythm of the relationship by making the empath dance between approval and rejection. But when the empath walks away and no longer plays the game, there's nothing left to manipulate, no narrative to twist, no spotlight to stand in. The narcissist is left backstage with no audience, and the truth they've spent a lifetime avoiding, that their self-worth has always been an illusion. At first, they might try to replace the empath quickly, thinking a new source of attention will fix the rupture. But no one else mirrors them the same way. No one else gives as deeply, feels as fully, or forgives as readily. And so the new supply often feels inadequate, shallow, temporary. The emptiness persists because the collapse isn't about who left, it's about what was exposed when they did. The narcissist is now face to face with their own hollowness, and the inner critic they buried beneath layers of charm and control begins to scream louder. They start to question their value, their likability, their significance. Not aloud, but in their quietest moments, in the dark corners where the mask can't follow. The collapse is not visible to everyone. They may still perform well at work, maintain social connections, even smile in pictures, but underneath it all, they are unraveling. Their identity, which was once defined by how others saw them, begins to feel unrecognizable. They may become reactive, paranoid, or impulsive, trying to assert control where it no longer exists. The emotional regulation they relied on from the empath is gone, and without it, their internal world spins out of balance. Rage may bubble up, depression may set in. Desperation leaks out through subtle attempts to regain the empath's attention, texts, guilt trips, veiled threats, or grand gestures. But none of it lands the same because the person who used to anchor them is no longer participating. And in that realization, the narcissist experiences something they've spent their life running from, the raw, unfiltered weight of their own unresolved wounds, echoing through a silence they can no longer escape. There comes a moment when the empath, who has spent so much of their life tuned into the needs, emotions, and expectations of others, begins to shift their gaze inward. It's not out of bitterness or resentment, but out of an aching realization that they have poured from a cup that no one ever bothered to refill. For too long, they've mistaken overgiving for love, self-sacrifice for connection, and emotional exhaustion for loyalty. They've endured cycles of confusion, manipulation, and subtle devaluation, all under the guise of being too sensitive, too emotional, or too much. And for just as long, they believed that if they just loved harder, were more patient, more understanding, maybe things would change. But love without boundaries isn't compassion. It's abandonment of self. And at some point, the empath begins to feel the cost of giving too much. A quiet, persistent erosion of their own identity. That's where reclamation begins. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with the smallest act of noticing, of asking, what about me? It starts with the realization that their emotions are valid, their boundaries matter, and their intuition has been whispering the truth all along. The empath begins to see that the discomfort they've been feeling was never their fault, that the emotional confusion wasn't theirs to carry, and that being kind-hearted does not require being self-sacrificial. This awakening is not dramatic. It's often lonely, sometimes terrifying, and always powerful, because in choosing themselves, the empath is breaking a pattern, not just in the relationship, but in their inner world. They begin to say no, not to punish anyone else, but to honor their own capacity. They begin to pull back their energy from places where it was drained, misused, or taken for granted. They stop explaining their worth, proving their loyalty, or defending their feelings to people who only listen to respond. They stop seeing their sensitivity as weakness and begin recognizing it as a gift, one that needs to be protected, not exploited. The empath no longer absorbs the moods of others or takes responsibility for someone else's emotional storms. Instead, they begin to anchor themselves, choosing stillness over chaos and truth over illusion. What they once called love, they now recognize as a wound that they are finally ready to heal. Healing for the empath doesn't mean they become hardened. It means they become clear. They begin to trust their own voice, listen to their own needs, and build relationships that are reciprocal, respectful, and rooted in authenticity. Their power comes not from dominating anyone else, but from no longer abandoning themselves to be chosen. They begin to make peace with solitude, with boundaries, with not being liked by everyone. And in doing so, they become someone who no longer needs external permission to feel whole. This reclamation is not loud, but it is unshakable. The empath, once consumed by the emotional needs of others, finally steps into their own light, not to be seen, but because they have finally remembered how to see themselves.